Narayan, Devatma.
Narayan, Atmalila, how are you?
I'm fine. So nice to see you.
So nice to see you. I'm so
Yeah.
looking forward to your class today. Tell us, what are you teaching us?
Well, today I want to speak with you about Kashmir Shaivism. And
Good.
I just studied a bit about this topic. And yeah, I just wanted to tell you something about it. And well, if we talk about Kashmir Shaivism, we talk about Lord Shiva. And
Mm.
Lord Shiva is also the auspicious one. And in India, he is really, yeah, you see statues of him everywhere through the whole country. And yeah, he's really important. And he's also called in India the Supreme God. And he also got a lot of different names. Eh? So the
Yeah.
Great Lord, the Great God, and yeah. So can you also tell a bit how you see Shiva? What you have experienced in India about Lord Shiva?
What I've experienced about Lord Shiva, the way that I understand Lord Shiva is as representing the Atman, or the spirit. And there is Shiva and there's Shakti. You could say the masculine polarity and the feminine polarity. And the masculine polarity of Shiva is consciousness. And the feminine polarity of Shakti is energy and matter. So she's the manifest dimension and he's the unmanifest dimension. And we can relate to this personally in our own experience of life, that there's the inner self and then there's the outer parts of our being, the body and the mind. And the outer parts of our body, anything that is subject to change, that is a part of energy and matter, which is on the spectrum of Shakti. But the inner being, the observer, the knower, the seer, the witness, the self, the real you, the one who is listening to the mind when the mind is dialoguing, that part of you that's always been you your whole life and has not changed regardless of all the external change, the indwelling soul. That is the Shiva element, as I understand it. And all these practices of yoga and meditation, they help to strengthen your ability to perceive that Shiva element, which is already there within you. And it's a more amount of silencing the mind, but we still have to strengthen the body and strengthen the mind so then it can become still and silent and we can just experience the Shiva element, which is our true nature.
Yeah, and in Kashmir Shaivism, Lord Shiva or Shiva is really important. And if you also look in the land of Kashmir, with the mountains, and here you see no snow, but there was, or in some periods, there's a lot of snow and rivers. The people used to live there, and there are also a lot of statues. So before the seers were there, and they just got their insights, and they just by wording to each other, because at first wasn't written down. But now you can see that there are everywhere statues in the landscape. And Shiva, Lord Shiva has 5 aspects. And his power is known as Chit, consciousness, Ananda, bliss, Icha, desire, Jnana is knowledge, and Kriya is action. So in all those parts, Yeah, you can see actually Shiva.
Kashmir Shaivism is a tradition that not a whole lot was written about. It was strictly passed down in the Guru disciple, the Guru Chela Shishya tradition. And so it was an oral tradition. And it was almost completely lost to us because of all the political conflict in this region. But we're very lucky to have had a few very strong sources of Kashmir Shaivism in the last 100 years, one being Swami Lakshmanju and the other being Swami Muktananda. And I've been initiated into the lineage of Swami Muktananda, and I can speak about my experience of being initiated into this tradition. I can speak to you about, some of the ideas of meditation and non-duality. But really, the topic of Kashmir Shaivism is a very lofty and, very kind of, well, it is, I would say, it's the highest form of philosophy that has evolved in the modern age.
Mhm.
It's the highest evolved philosophy that evolved out of India. And even in modern times, nowhere else in the world do we have anything that really rivals the teachings of non-duality that belong to the tradition of Kashmir Shaivism.
Devatma, tell a bit about what you have studied or read about Kashmir Shaivism.
I haven't really studied anything of Kashmir Shaivism. My knowledge of Kashmir Shaivism comes through just personal practice of being initiated into a lineage belonging to Kashmir Shaivism. And so the experience that the scriptures are writing about, I have experienced directly as a result of Shaktipat.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really more of a personal experience that is an experience of oneness. The Shakti is what takes you back to Shiva. And the Shakti, for example, in my case, after receiving Shaktipat, I experienced tremendous bliss in my heart. And that bliss of Shakti, it's an energy after all,
Mm-hmm.
it silenced my mind, it cooled the flames of my mind, and allowed me to be able to perceive silence. And in that mental silence, total oneness. And see, Kashmir Shaivism, non-duality, resolves some of the issues of duality that are described previously in the dualistic traditions such as Samkhya. Samkhya is duality and postulates the existence of two forces, two eternal forces, Purusha and Prakriti. There's the soul, and then there is the manifest dimension governed by nature. And so we have the animal, and we have the indwelling soul within the animal,
Mm-hmm.
right? And however, this creates a certain division. And non-duality resolves all of that and tells us that everything is actually consciousness. And there is no such thing as duality. But this is a higher teaching and a higher philosophy, and is really something that's more meant for the guru-disciple relationship, because you have to have that initiation, that mantra. What is the sadhana of Kashmir Shaivism? The only sadhana I know that I've ever been taught is your mantra, to use your mantra. And so Shaktipat and Mantra Diksha and Mantra Anustan, this is all incredibly important in this system.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a result of chanting your mantra, we do end up releasing an inner power. This inner energy awakens that leads you back to that experience of oneness in which you transcend the mind completely, the three levels of mind, the waking, dreaming, and deep sleep state, and you experience just pure consciousness. So how can we relate to this idea of everything being consciousness? For example, in the Shiva Sutras, verse 1,
Mhm.
it declares that everything is consciousness, that Atma is consciousness. And so if you think about, for example, in a dream, if you can recall the most realistic dream that you ever had, and in that dream, the objects that seemed physical, they actually really felt like they were real things in your dream. They seemed physical, seemed like it was real. You touched it, you felt it. There's maybe even other sensations in your dream. I've had dreams that were so potent that I actually woke up still actually feeling or smelling or carrying some of the sensations from the dream world into the wake. But yet everything in the dream reality, everything we know wasn't real, doesn't have any existence in material physical reality. In everything in the dream was made up out of consciousness. We fashioned it out of our own consciousness, out of our own mind, the dream. And likewise, here in this reality too, everything is consciousness. We construct our entire realities out of consciousness.
Mhm.
And it is an inner being, an inner intelligence that we have to wake up to. That at this point, for most of us, is still asleep. And so that Shiva awakening represents that highest awakening of your soul, where your soul wakes up from its slumber, and you perceive spiritual truth. So most of us are creating our own illusions of reality. We're filtering everything through the mechanism of our ego mind, relating to everything through our past experiences, and everybody is filtering everything out according to their own past history and ego in a different way, right? That's duality. Can we ever know anything outside of our mind? Can we ever know anything outside of our ego? Or do we always have to live with inside the prison of our mind? To answer that, the Shaivite yogis, they went into the highest states of meditation to say that, yes, on the one hand, you cannot experience anything outside the mind. Everything is the mind. But on the other hand, that which is beyond the mind, that pure consciousness, pure existence, that which is eternal, that can be perceived through the vehicle of the mind, through the catalyst of the mind. And so by training the mind and silencing the mind in meditation, through the mind, via the mind, meaning you have to stay awake in the deepest states of meditation, you can experience that total infinite bliss, which is, it's quite simply, it's when you're totally in the now, perceiving this infinite present moment, this eternal now, and the pure bliss that is part and parcel of this eternal now of pure existence, pure consciousness. So it's a vast topic, Kashmir Shaivism, and that's why I don't even consider myself qualified to speak on it. But I can tell you about my own personal experiences after being initiated into a tradition stemming from Kashmir Shaivism, and the experience, what is awakened within the heart after Shaktipat, is by far the most powerful, most beautiful experience that I've ever had in my life. And by far is the defining experience of my life, or what I would like to think of as defines me
Mhm.
more than anything else.
Mhm.
So you have so many good notes here. Why don't you continue telling us what is Kashmir Shaivism, Atmalila?
Yeah, well, it's a spiritual practice. They describe um, it's also the Trika Shaivism, and they also have it about Pratyabhijna, or the recognition. So, and what do they mean about recognition? What is the word recognition? So I recognize, yeah, I recognize you, but do I recognize Shiva? Or so that is a really important word. And I was also with myself with that word. It's also a memory, or is it a memory of something? Where I also would like to talk with you about this word recognition, because you see that a lot in the tradition also. And they have it also about the trident, yeah. And you also see that with Shiva, and that's also actually, yeah, the symbol of, yeah, the way of the three states. And you can also see that here above in a yantra. And they also tell about the three energies of the supreme goddess, the Para-apara, and the Apara Sakti. Know anything about the word recognition?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting choice of wording and really describes the goal of our spiritual efforts, because there's nothing really to attain. Really, what we do is we recognize who we really are.
Yeah.
And the problem is we suffer because we don't know who we are. And we are projecting ourselves out onto the world in a vain attempt to derive a sense of self and to derive meaning from the world. And as long as we have that avidya, that ignorance of who we really are, then we're always like a dog chasing its tail. We're always trying to find satisfaction and contentment in the world when it can only be found within.
Mm-hmm.
Because those qualities of satisfaction, contentment, bliss, joy, serenity, happiness, those are all qualities of you, of your own self, not the objects of the senses. And so when we are deluded, when we don't know who we are, we don't know our own qualities of joy and bliss and love, happiness, then we try to find those things outside of us. And when we experience those things, we falsely believe it's because of those external objects of the senses. We don't even know that it's our own self. The example is, it's like a dog chewing on a bone, and the bone is splintering and causing cuts in his gums. And the dog is actually now starting to taste fresh blood. And the dog likes the taste of fresh blood, so it goes on gnawing at the bone, falsely thinking that the blood is coming from the bone, when really it's coming from himself. Well, this is similar to how we are actually going through the world, exhausting ourselves, chasing our own tail in the world, trying to find contentment and satisfaction through the objects of the senses, when it can only be found within our own selves.
Yeah.
And so this is the process of recognition, recognizing who we really are. And the tendency, and it's like gravity, the tendency is to identify with the ego mind and the body, because that's what's apparent. But the Atman, the inner self, is not apparent. It's on the unmanifest level. So we don't see it, so we don't know that it exists, we don't identify with it. But yet it's who we really are. So there's this process we have to go through of unplugging from the false identifications before we can then plug in to our truth. And most of yoga practices, this is why Samkhya philosophy, dualism, is first taught before the advanced teachings of Kashmir Shaivism and Trika. Because duality, the teachings of duality, of Purusha and Prakriti, helps you to separate out the false identifications. Helps you to develop that, that higher awareness and that intuition, that discernment. It helps you to develop that discernment of knowing that, yes, I have a body, but I am not my body. My body is subject to change and impermanent, therefore not self. Yes, I have emotions. Yes, I have a mind, but I am not my thoughts and I am not my emotions. And so it helps us to separate out when we understand the philosophy of Samkhya. But the problem with Samkhya and duality is that there is not two. Ultimately, there's just one reality. There's just one truth, one bliss, one heart, one love, one reality, one consciousness. And so after using the teachings of duality to unplug from our false identifications and detaching from the wrong parts, the external parts of who we are, then we use these higher teachings of Kashmir Shaivism to recognize who we really are and to plug in to that. And so that's yoga. So recognition is to recognize the self. And I really like this term, self-recognition, better than self-realization, even though they're both adequate terms. But for me, recognition is better because you recognize who you really are. You recognize then you are not the mind and the body and the ego, but you are that higher self that has experienced all of that, all of those changes. Even though the mind changes, the ego changes, the body changes, the inner self has always been you. And you're just not aware of it. So Trika Yoga, or Kashmir Shaivism, is the process of becoming aware to your truth, who you really are. And it's a very philosophical system.
Yeah.
It's, it doesn't have 8 limbs with a bunch of, asanas and pranayams and mudras and bandhas. It's more of a philosophical system that is meant to be taught in unison with a meditation training. So, like we said earlier, it's a verbal oral tradition. And the context in which Kashmir Shaivism was learned was always in that guru-disciple relationship of learning how to meditate and using these sutras, going through the sutras one at a time, and then reflecting on them, meditating on them, and deepening your practice of meditation, which, it's pre-existing. It's kind of a given that you've already been able to meditate and gain a certain amount of proficiency in your yoga before you start learning Kashmir Shaivism. That's not always the case. It depends on who your guru is. I wasn't. I just met my guru. She initiated me, and now I'm part of this tradition. But it took me years, really, to figure out the philosophy, what it's all about. Besides the intellectual part, being able to apply my own experience of using the mantra to be able to understand some of these lofty philosophies and ideas.
Yeah, and it's also different if you grew up.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotations from Swami Muktananda that's really stayed with me is, God experiences himself through you as you. You are what God is doing. And this idea is a bit different than the Judeo-Christian way of seeing things. The Judeo-Christian way, I'm not trying to say that I'm an expert on that philosophy because I don't, and others probably know better, but it's more about that God is outside of you and you are a sinner and you have to hope for redemption, that your soul will be redeemed and you can gain passage back into the kingdom of heaven or else eternal damnation in hell, right? But here, this philosophy is saying that God only exists through you, that consciousness itself is divine, and outside of conscious beings, there is no God. conscious life in the universe is what gives purpose to the universe, because it's what allows the universe to experience itself. And without conscious life, the whole universe would just be a mass of cells. Who would even know if anything existed at all? And human life gives the universe a chance to not only experience itself, but to know that it is experiencing itself. We have that higher faculty of buddhi that you can know. And that is what needs to become enlightened, or that is what needs to recognize.
Yeah.
Then it is not the body, mind, ego, then it is Shiva.
Yeah.
And Shiva is not something external to you. And all of these Indian gods they're not foreign spirits out there. These are all archetypal representations of parts of you.
Yeah.
Shiva is you. Yeah, I think one of the important things that Kashmir Shaivism helps people with in their daily life, how is this practical? How is this applicable to me in my personal life? Is that this helps you to be able to figure out that there's an intelligence beyond the mind.
Yeah.
And there's an intelligence beyond the ego. You can influence your mind. You can witness your mind, and you can influence your mind. You can control your mind. Therefore, there's an intelligence beyond the mind. Now, some would say, yeah, that's the ego. And that's true, I agree. And if we look at the model of the 36 tattvas of Kashmir Shaivism, we can see that, yes, after mind, we have ego. So yes, ego influences the mind. But you can also control how egotistical you are, can't you? Well, most of us can. This is the higher faculty of buddhi. So buddhi is what is going to now influence whether or not you are egotistical, or is what's going to allow you to control the mind. And in this system of meditation, it strengthens buddhi. You are practicing deep contemplation and introspection. And also a big part of this is also atmavichara, self-inquiry, asking, who am I? Who am I? Separating out the false identifications, realizing the true self, recognizing the true self.
Yeah. And they talk about, in Shaivism, about the 77 sutras. And that's the sutras are a note or a code. And it describes the essence in a few words. And sutras are often chanted in meditation. And many who have a spiritual yoga practice use the sutra as a guide to life. And here we short have it about the Shiva Sutras. And it's a collection of 77 aphorisms.
The Shiva Sutras are considered the most important core writings for Kashmir Shaivism. And we can continue after the Shiva Sutras in so many directions. You can study the Pratyabhijna Hridayam, for example, or other similar philosophies. But it all really starts with the Shiva Sutras. And these are 77 very short little verses, sometimes only 2 words. And it's very rich in philosophical wisdom. So I strongly recommend, whether you are initiated or not, if you have any interest in Kashmir Shaivism for one reason or the other, attain, if you can, try to find a copy of the Shiva Sutras and just go over it verse by verse. And it's very fun to read. This can be a practice of self-reflection, introspection, just reading one verse and then taking the next couple of minutes to reflect on that, meditate on that, digest it, before you then read the next verse. And in this way, maybe it's going to take you a couple of days or a whole week just to read these 77 aphorisms. But it's what I would call it's higher philosophy, and this is similar to, for example, like Jnana Yoga, as well as Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga, in the sense that this is the result of the higher understandings and attitudes that are developed after you've been meditating for some time. So after you've been doing yoga for so many years, you've been meditating for so many years, and you're starting, you have you at this point, you have a foundational understanding for the philosophies of yoga, and you want to go to that next level where it can become for you like religion. It can become for you like scripture, where you can just read through this really slow and just nurture your soul, just water the roots of your life by reading each verse slowly, slowly. So like Karma Yoga, I would describe Karma Yoga as an attitude of higher awareness, of how to be able to act in the world. And so you can bring the higher awareness you developed during your Raja Yoga, Hatha Yoga, and Kriya Yoga. You can take that higher awareness with you now into the world through your attitude of non-doership, which is Karma Yoga, through your attitude of devotion and love, Bhakti Yoga, and through higher knowledge, knowing of truth through direct inner experience, Jnana Yoga. And so these higher yogas are the fruits of the lesser yogas. And by lesser, I just mean, first we have to have a practice, and we have to start to do yoga, and you have to learn how to meditate. And then after you've been meditating for some time, you become comfortable in it, then you start to experience the fruits. And those fruits are nurtured in the higher yogas, of which I would include Kashmir Shaivism as being one of these higher yogas. It's an attitude and a philosophy, an attitude and a philosophy of oneness, total oneness, non-duality. There's only one consciousness. And for me, the essence of Kashmir Shaivism, and I'm not a scholar on Kashmir Shaivism, but for me, the essence of it is that there's one consciousness we all share in. It's not my consciousness or your consciousness. It's one consciousness, universal existence, and it's eternal. And when we silence the mind, which is individual, when we silence the individual mind, then you can experience that universal consciousness. It's microcosm, macrocosm. Your mind is derived from that consciousness. The mind comes out of pure consciousness, and then it goes back into the silence of pure consciousness. All thoughts come out of that and merge back into that. And that is what is our truth. That is our true nature that persists throughout all the change, all the thoughts that come and go, all the changes in your body that comes and goes. That bliss of the self is always there. And without that bliss, life would be intolerable. It's only because of that self-born bliss that life is tolerable at all. But we're not aware to it. It's like a fish has no concept of being wet because it lives its whole life in the water. We don't have any concept of bliss, most of us, because it's your true nature. It's the fundamental quality of existence. It's the backdrop in which we all live. We exist in a sea of bliss. We just have to become sensitive to it. And so that's what the mantra and the teachings of Kashmir Shaivism, this is what it's helped me to be able to enjoy and experience, is that oneness of pure consciousness. And then compassion and your heart blossoms because you realize that that which I most essentially am is the same exact thing that you most essentially are. on that love of pure beingness, on that love of pure existence, pure consciousness. We are all one, not just identical, or because identical implies there's sameness across some differences, right? But no, we are all one. There is no division. On that level of pure consciousness, we are one. And so your compassion is most full. You can, if you don't understand your essential oneness with other people, then you can fake compassion. But compassion is real when you realize or recognize that you and everybody else are essentially one and the same. Your suffering becomes my suffering, and your joy becomes my joy. And I don't want to do you wrong or harm you any more than I would want to myself.
Yeah. Thank you, Devatma. Yeah, and I think that's also the aim of this philosophy, to what we're talking about, of that self-recognition. And if we look into the beautiful landscape with the mountains and the nature, then already the mind gets quiet. Huh? So here, I think the seers who lived in that time, they just, the Kashapa and the mountain of Kashapa. So they also, I think, what they try to describe is also the natural elements. That's what you also see in Shiva or the Om Namah Shivaya. They also respect the elements that they are given to us. So the water has been given to us, and the air, and all the elements are also in us. So what we see outside in nature is also in us. And I think as long as we don't respect all those things, what we have been given, it will also come back to us. So it's a cycle, I think, as well. And
not only that, but I'd say that we are missing our relationship with ourself.
Yeah.
And that our poor relationship with nature is a syndrome of our poor relationship with ourselves. And that the reason that we don't have a good relationship with nature is first and foremost because we don't have a good relationship with ourselves. And this is one thing that the Tattva Shuddhi practice helps us to do, is we go through, we meditate on each element of nature. And by meditating on each element of nature, we are expanding our awareness into it and merging with it and helping to be able to correct any imbalances we have within our own system as well, because we are all made up of these 5 elements of nature after all. But anyway, this has been such a great class, Atmalila.
Yeah.
Yep.
So thank you very much, Devatma, for this.
Thank you, Atmalila. This has been a really great lecture. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for putting it all together and for hosting this.